Hi everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to today's PQSL session. We're just going to give it a minute there before we get started so that everyone has time to join and get settled if you have your lunch there with you. So we'll be starting in the next moment or two. Hey everyone, just to say hello to everyone who's joining us there. We'll be starting in the next couple of seconds for everybody. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to today's session on leasing and letting, which is the first in our Nexus PQSL series in 2024. So we're absolutely delighted to have you today. And today's session, Robert will be giving you an overview on the leasing and letting competency to level 3 with an APC examination focus, but also bringing Robert's own real life experiences to the discussion as well. So this session will be particularly of interest to our APC property discipline trainees, and particularly those across commercial property practice, valuation, residential and property management, which have leasing and letting as a core and optional competency. So we're delighted to have Robert Mulcair, as I said, who's MSCSI and MRICS, join us for today's session. And Robert is an Associate Director in the Investor Leasing team with CBRE. And Robert started his career in CBRE in 2019 on the graduate rotation program, completing his APC interview in April 2022. So in the day-to-day role for Robert, his role is largely involved with leasing and letting of office space with a property portfolio across Dublin city centre. And having come through the APC process, Robert is very familiar with the PQSL requirements for current APC trainees. So I encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if there's any questions that you'd like us to ask Robert at the Q&A or discussion at the end of the session. So just to remind you to pop your question in there. So Robert, delighted to welcome you today, and I'll hand over to you now.
Perfect. Thanks, Ruth. So just a further bit of background on myself. So I've been in CBRE now for just over 4.5 years. So I started in September 2019 on the graduate rotation program. I did a year in healthcare, then 6 months in valuations. And then I moved across to the investor leasing team in offices where I've spent 2.5 years now. So I got chartered. I had 2 years experience. I submitted my APC and got chartered in April 2022. So generally my day-to-day role does involve the leasing and letting of offices. We deal with anything from sub 5,000 square feet, smaller landlords, all the way up to large international investment funds that could be dealing with 400,000 square foot campuses. So it does vary. Generally, you're taking a leasing deal or transaction from the start. You're pitching, you're getting your marketing material ready, you do your viewings, you're negotiating your heads of terms, and then you get into legals and you negotiate your lease as well along with the solicitors. So it's just important to note that the leasing and letting there is questions all the way from the start of the process to the end as well until you sign the lease. So just what we're going to chat on today, the presentation, I'm going to have a strong focus on APC, obviously, and just on what questions generally come up and what they expect at different, or what I feel through my experience they expect at different levels in terms of whether you're doing level 1, level 2, or level 3 for leasing and letting as a competency. So just to start off, so just leasing and letting, description of the competency in context of the sector. So this competency is specifically related to the market for leasehold property and includes assignments. Candidates should be able to demonstrate an understanding and experience of working for both landlord and tenant. So just to give you a feel of what the description that the SCSI put on it and what they expect from you. So level 1, you really need to be able to demonstrate a knowledge and understanding of how various types of properties are let. So that's just demonstrating your knowledge. Level 2, you need to be able to apply that knowledge and skills and show some practical experience associated with the knowledge and skills that you have. And then level 3 is more provide evidence and of reasons, advice that you've provided or reported to clients. So just an example of level 1, you need to understand the market for leasing and letting and how values and lease terms may be affected in the market. That's more your understanding on the market. Level 2, you just need to be able to show experience taking a leasing transaction from the start to the end, you know, the marketing, the viewings, all the way to signing the lease. And then level 3 is more providing reasoned advice and more complex deals and showing how that deal was slightly more complex than a standard leasing deal. So just the first point that the questions that come up is, you know, what main lease terms may affect value. So they are quite standard, to be honest, in terms of, you know, your length of lease, what is your term certain. Obviously, when you're in evaluation purposes, you're looking at what's the term certain left in the lease and the income, and then obviously potential purchasers will also be looking at what income profile is there and what length of income is left. Your rent, obviously very standard in terms of this, what's going to be capitalized, and whatever yield you're using in terms of your income is going to be capitalized, and that's going to affect your value. So in terms of, they'll go through all these, but just the background on the how it affects, knowing why these terms affect value is just what you should be aware of this when you're doing any sort of leasing deal in terms of the different terms and how they're going to affect value. You know, your clients are always, when you're doing a leasing deal, you should be adding value to the property, and your clients are always very aware of and will ask you questions in terms of how it's going to affect value. So your break option in terms of how many months notice the tenant needs to provide, what are the assumptions around the break option, is there a break penalty in place, and is it a tenant or landlord break option as well. Repairing covenants, you should familiarise yourselves with the FRI and IRI repairing covenants. So the FRI is full repair and insuring lease, IRR is internal repair and insuring. So full repair and insuring is full, the tenant has full repair and insuring covenants. The IRI is more watered down version repairing covenant, which is internal repairing and insuring. Generally, in a multi-tenanted building, the FRI repair clause would be by way of service charge, you pay into service charge, which will affect and create your FRI lease. Tenants covenants, we're actually going to touch on that as we go down. Rent review clause, in terms of what you need to be aware of, is your assumptions. In your rent review clause, you know, what lease term are you assuming when it comes to negotiating your rent at rent review, and what are your disregards. So example of assumptions would be your lease length, your specification. Your disregards on the rent review clause would be tenants improvements and tenants goodwill, that they get disregarded when negotiating the new rent. Guarantee obviously is extremely important when you're looking at valuing, or if someone's looking at acquiring a building, in terms of what the covenant strength is there. If the covenant strength isn't extremely strong, there is different ways you can counteract this, in terms of you can either take a cash deposit, you can get a parent company guarantee, or you can get a bank annuity. So they're just the main terms that affect value that you need to be aware of when doing a leasing transaction. So another question that comes up is the contents of a heads of terms document. So the first point you should always note when asked this question, or even doing up a heads of terms, is you need to put in subject to contract / contract denied. This obviously just sets out this a non-binding agreement between the tenant and the landlord. So you need to make sure that you have that in. Then obviously you're just hitting points in terms of landlord, proposed tenant, demise, size, bites, car spaces, your rent, your term, obviously the term of your lease, your break option. Generally, the terms, if you, in the heads of terms, you're just looking at the break option in terms of how many months notice you need to provide, and is it a landlord and tenant break option. Then when you get into the lease, you further negotiate the break option clause. Rent free, how much rent free are you giving? If you're giving rent free at the start, is it staggered? So that's all set out in heads of terms. Condition, spec on handover. So is the building or the floor being handed over as shell and core? If it is being handed over shell and core, generally there's a Cat A credit provided. What is a Cat A credit? This is all negotiated in the head of terms. Spec, is it given in Cat A form as a landlord put in the Cat A, or is it fully fitted and furnished and as seen on the viewing? Alienation, this is in terms of your right to sublease or assign your lease. So generally there is clauses in there in terms of there's there's a maximum number of sublettings you can do. So that's in your alienation clause, and do you need landlord approval to sublease and assign? And generally the answer is always yes, but that's again set out in the heads of terms. Alterations, what sort of alterations can you do without landlord approval? So generally non-structural and structural alterations generally do need landlord approval for both, but sometimes non-structural small alterations you don't. Insurance, that's just your insurance rate, service charge, service charge rate, rates, listers and conditions. So generally they will ask you to name 5 to 10 of these contents of the heads of terms and explain them. So the main content of the lease, it's obviously very similar to the heads of terms in terms of you've negotiated your heads of terms, now you're bringing it into your lease negotiations. So again, this is a common question in the APC, is just the main contents of a lease. You need to be aware of minimum between, again, could be anywhere up to 5 and 10 main contents of the lease. So obviously you have your date, parties, which is the landlord and tenant, the demise again similar to the heads of terms, the term, rent, outgoing, the repair obligation, your user clause. So obviously if you're doing an office leasing deal, the use is office, and it needs to, you can only use that demise for office use. Your break option, we'll negotiate this one further in terms of if there's penalties, again, what's the notice period, then the definitions of the different clauses in the lease. Guarantee, you've touched on alienation again, this is your right, sublet and assign. Then you'll have a map, and then your rent review clause. So in the lease, you'll have to put down what the assumptions, disregards are of the rent review, which we touched on. So another common question is the difference between a lease versus a license. So a lease, the tenant enjoys exclusive possession of the demise, whereas in a license, you've no interest in the land, and license gives no interest to the tenant in the land. So you can assign a lease, you can't assign or transfer your interest to a third party in a license. Binding against a party that the lease, binding against a party that buys a freehold interest from landlords, whereas a license is irrevocable at any time. The lease obviously cannot be terminated until its term expires, unless it contains an early termination period, or you've hit a lease event in terms of, you've exercised your break option or surrender, etc. Whereas there's no statutory right of renewal in a license. Whereas with a lease, if you haven't signed a deed of renunciation, renouncing your rights, if you're in situ and you have a lease for longer than 4 years, 9 months, you have the right to renew. So main tenant covenants in the lease. So there's landlord and tenant covenants within the lease, and the main tenant covenants, which again is a very common question from these tests in the APC, is to yield up. This in relation to the spec and the condition that you leave the property in when you're exiting the demise. Now obviously this is negotiated at the start in terms of how you're going to yield up, and it's contingent usually on the spec that you've taken the premises in. And so if you take it in Cat A, generally the landlord will ask you to yield up to a Cat A specification. To repair and decorate, so to keep in good order for the tenant. To pay rent, obviously the similar, pay rent, rates and service charge. Alterations, obviously to apply, if there is any alteration you're looking to do, and you have to have landlord consent for these alterations, so to apply for the consent for the alterations. Pay interest on arrears, to pay outgoings and taxes. User, obviously what is the user clause in terms of, is it office? You have to, you can't be using it for anything else other than office, and to pay the insurance. So the main landlord covenants in the lease, so there's less landlord covenants in the lease. So to insure the building, the landlord must insure the building. Now the tenant will pay the insurance, but the landlord must insure the building to provide the tenant with quiet enjoyment, and then also to carry out any repairs, service charge works, etc. So the tenant will be paying to the service charge, or the landlord must keep the common areas and repairs through. If the tenant is in an FRI lease but with a service charge, they must continue to repair the property. So as we touched on, if a tenant hasn't signed a DOR, a deed of renunciation, announcing their rights, and they've been in situ and had a lease for longer than 4 years, 9 months, they do have renewal rights. Now, again, another question that comes up. So when can a landlord deny a tenant a new lease when they have renewal rights? So there are a few points to note that a landlord can deny that tenant a new lease when they do have renewal rights. So the first one is non-payment of rent. Now, obviously, they're in breach of their covenants, as we touched on, tenant covenants to pay rent. So if they're in breach of their covenants, a landlord can deny a tenant the right to renew. The tenancy has been terminated by notice to quit or otherwise. Now, if the landlord has planning to pull down or reconstruct the building, there is, and it's not one to touch on today, but there is compensation, disturbance compensation that the landlord will have to pay to the tenant, but they can refuse a new lease with the right to renewal if they do a full planning permission to pull down or reconstruct the property, if the landlord is a local authority. And then the last one, which is not as clear cut as the ones above, the tenancy would not be consistent with good estate management. And that one's obviously a little bit harder to prove. But if the landlord can prove that's not consistent with good estate management, they do have the right to deny the tenant a new lease or lease renewal. So that's generally in terms of, just wanted to keep it very pointed in terms of the main points that come up in the APC and just around the focus of the main factors that these sessions will be asking on the leasing and letting as a competency. Now, there are additional areas to discuss, and they are tied in and cohesive with the leasing and letting competency. So first is yield up and dilapidation. So obviously, so we touched on that. Yield up is your yield up clause, what specification you need to leave or condition you need to leave the property in when you're leaving. Now, often this is negotiated at the end, which is your dilapidations negotiation and the works you need to do to the floor of the property before you leave. Then also the rent review clause. Now, I know there is going to be another whole PQSL and rent reviews, but you need to be aware of this when you're negotiating into your lease and your new letting. So 28th of February 2010 was after that. There was upward only rent reviews were banned, so it had to be on level upward and downwards rent reviews. So you just need to be aware of that. Also, your PSRA letters, that's your agreement with your client, that's your contract with the landlord. So you need to be aware of the contents of the PSRA letter. You shouldn't be conducting a lease or acting for a client without a PSRA letter in place. Inspection, just obviously you need to be aware of how you're conducting inspections in terms of what the asset is, if it's office, retail, industrial. Measurement, again, it does, you will have to do joint measurements when you're doing measurements when you're doing a leasing deal with your tenant, but that's a separate issue as well. But in terms of measurement, in terms of different assets, office, retail, industrial, if it's office, is it in the city, is it in the suburbs, is it NIA or GIA, or IPMS2 or IPMS3, and then just viewing procedures. From the start of a leasing transaction, you will be obviously doing viewings, and what are the procedures for that in terms of health and safety, obviously, as well. So that they are points that to note that will come up, but they're not directly under the leasing and letting competency. So that was a brief take you through of the leasing and letting competency. Now, hopefully there's a few questions as well to come. So there is a Q&A. So if we're there, if there are any questions.
Great. So just to encourage anyone to pop their questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions that you'd like Robert to go through with you. Robert, one came directly to me, so I might just kind of kick that off if you don't mind. Having come through the APC process yourself, what advice would you give to any of our trainees who are on the call today who are preparing perhaps for their upcoming final assessment interview kind of in the coming months, and how to prepare to answer questions on this particular competency?
I suppose the main thing is I'm not sure what level they're or what stage they're at, but if they have submitted their submission, I suppose, and then they're in between studying the interview, the best thing really is to do mock questions, in my opinion, and you know, find a buddy that you can do questions with. And then also just try and get in front of a panel, you know, at least 2 or 3 times before you sit, just mock questions, just keep answering questions. Obviously, you can sit and learn notes, but actually putting yourself under the pressure of a panel in front of you, and there's different questions that aren't coming on your notes that they're going to ask you. And in terms of just circling back to leasing and letting, again, if you are taking it to level 3, you know, you would hopefully have spent a bit of time in an agency department where you have good experience in leasing and letting, and it's just on the day, keep trying to bring in examples of how you have hit this competency. If there is a question in relation to anything, leasing, letting again, and it flows through all the APC interviews, just examples of how you have had experience and how you have dealt with whatever question or issue they're asking you.
Yeah, no, and I'm actually going to pick up on a point that you said there, just about the examples. When I'm speaking with trainees starting out on the process, we encourage everyone to keep kind of detailed records of different examples, so that when they're preparing for their interview, they can utilize those examples as well. So no, that's great to hear from someone who's come through the process. A question that's come into us there is how effective is FRI differ from F or I? Oh, I think that's
FRI and IR. Yeah.
Yes.
So FRI is full repairing and insuring, and IR is, as I said, is internal repair and insuring. So effectively, if a tenant is sitting in a building and they could be in a multi-tenanted building and it's an FRI lease by way of service charge, they are paying into service charge, which is covering all the repairs of a building as such in terms of external as well, and the facade and everything, whereas IRI is more just internal in terms of their demise. And there is a onerous on the tenant. There is a big difference for FRI in terms of it's a lot more contingent repair clause.
Great, thank you. We have someone online today who's not in a practice. Do you have any advice for helping, or where they might seek out kind of some mock questions? So I might jump in there first, just to say that your supervisor and counsellor would often be able to assist in kind of mock interviews through their own networks. Have you any kind of advice or guidance from your own experiences, Robert?
Yeah, well, generally, like working in CBRE, it's a bit larger practice, and there is, you know, there's plenty of mentors and people that have been through it as well. So I suppose a lot of my stuff came internally. Now I also do think it's good to try and get a mock interview externally as well. Now it is hard sitting in front of your boss, I suppose, to do a mock interview as well, but just to get a more of an outside view on it as well, not just internally in-house. I'll try and set up a mock interview with different practices as well. Now I know you need connections to that, but if you can.
Yeah, no, I think through employers, supervisors, and counsellors, people are very willing to support trainees coming through that process. And obviously, if there's anything our own education team can help with, you know, you can get in touch with us too. We have another question here, Robert, for you. So what are some examples of typical landlord concessions being given to tenants in recent transactions, extended rent freeze, capital contribution, etc.?
Yeah, so it's obviously one you need to be very aware of in terms of the market in your interview. So what we are seeing at the moment is there are headline rents basically in offices are remaining quite steady, especially for prime and super prime areas up around, we're calling them in Seabury at €65 per square foot. Then we have seen deals being done higher in around super prime areas, Dawson Street and Kildare Street. There is a lot more rent free being given on these deals. So in terms of your net effectives are going to be lower, but your headline rents are remaining the same. We did say that generally rent freeze, it was trending between 1 and 1.5 months of rent free per year term certain. Now it's probably at the higher end of that at the moment. So landlords that are trying to get deals are throwing more rent free at deals at the moment, but trying to stick their headline rents generally in line with what they were at. So I suppose, yeah, to answer that, there's a lot more rent free been giving. On the capital contribution piece, not as much. More so we have seen landlords look at potentially fitting out their floors themselves, which obviously is better for incoming tenants. They don't have to put as much into their fit out. So generally the landlords are trying to come up with smart ideas, whether it's either fitting the floor out or else, just providing more rent free.
We just actually had a clarification on our mock interview and mock questions. They were looking for guidance on mock questions rather than interviews. So I just say that we don't have a bank of questions that we'd make available to candidates. And it would be, my advice would be through a mock interview, getting used to hearing how the questions are phrased rather than it being a bank of questions that we'd have for candidates. Robert, was there anything you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, I think in terms of the questions as well, it's actually, when you try and answer them out loud, it's sometimes a bit tricky. You think you know the answer, but actually when you get asked in front of a panel and they ask you and you have to explain it and give an example, it's practice. And when it comes to the actual interview, you've probably answered that question hopefully a couple of times before and it's come up in a mock before. So I think that's the most beneficial way.
I agree.
Practice.
Getting used to answering questions out loud. Like, as you say, you think you know something and then there might be words or phrases that you trip over. So it's only by kind of saying them out loud do you get to do that. Absolutely. Another question for you, Robert. In your opinion, do you think a candidate could be asked about prime yields, rent per square foot? The person's noting then it could be difficult to recall exact figures.
Yeah, I think it can be asked and it has been asked. Generally, obviously different house views of different headline or prime rents, but you do need to be aware of the market in different sectors and different assets and classes and how they're performing and what the headline rents are and what the yields are. So there is, I know in Seabury we have different yield sheets. There is different ways of learning it, but you do just need to be aware of the market and what's going on in terms of pricing and yields and rents. Yeah.
And I'd reiterate that from our perspective then as well, that particularly if there's something in a submission, the candidate is expected to be able to answer questions and recall details that have been included in that. Right, Robert, I think that might be all of our questions for you today. So we have a question there just about regarding green leases, if there's any questions coming up regarding them.
When I was doing, there is green leases aren't actually generally in the market. They're not a massive thing at the moment. There are different clients that are trying to bring them in, and where we see it more is in green clauses in leases, which I suppose you could maybe call a green lease, but they're not full green leases. There's different green clauses, and you need to keep your building or your floor, and you need to initiatives keeping a certain BR and different sustainability ratings and credentials. But it is a factor, and I think it definitely could be asked in an interview around green leases. Yeah. Great.
Fantastic, Robert. We might just end it there. We've had a lot of questions fired at you there, so thank you very much for your time, both delivering the session and your sharing your experiences and insight with everyone online today. So thank you very much, Robert, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone.